Welcome back to the Strategy of Everything. My name is Dave Thomas. This episode is called The Strategy of Leadership. And so I sat down with Alex Brueckmann. He's the author of The Strategy Legacy. Alex talks all about, in his book and in our interview, he talks a lot about how your role as a leader is not just for you and your team, it's for the broader company and the broader existence. And that is really how you leave your legacy as a leader. So lots to learn from Alex as usual. So please stick around and enjoy the interview with Alex Brueckmann. Alex, thanks for joining me. Good to see you again.
Likewise. Thanks for having me, Dave.
Yeah, great. Listen, I just wanted to dive right in with the strategy legacy and kind of start picking your brain a little bit about, your process, how it came to be. Give us a little bit of, the journey. How did you decide to write books? And then, how'd you get here?
The book is actually an accident, if you really want to be honest. It was never meant to be a book to be published. It came in the aftermath of what I call a self-induced external shock. So my spouse and I, we decided to relocate from Germany to Canada, where she's from. And in that process, I started to realize that I felt kind of guilty, leaving all my clients behind in Europe, while I was also moving closer to those in North America. But still, there was this feeling. And a friend of mine and I, we talked about this feeling. And he basically was the father of the idea of then writing down what I have been doing with these clients in a way that they can actually do it without me when I'm gone. Mm-hmm. But that was the starting point. But that ended up to be hundreds of pages. And at some point in that process, I was like, no one's going to read that. It's just too much. Mm-hmm. And in that process, the idea was born to actually condense it into a nonfiction book that provides value for every leader that wants to run strategy in a way that actually produces results. Mm-hmm. And that's how the book came to life. And then things kind of spiraled from there.
Tell me a little bit more about the process of writing a book as an accident, because I feel I'm in a similar space where I feel like I've got these ideas and these concepts and these things that I want to share. I guess it has to be a book because that's what people do. They write books in business and then they, become famous millionaire authors, right? So tell me a little bit about the process. You said you wrote everything down, but how did you actually start to work through the project, and condense everything down, like you said?
I think this is different for everyone. For me, it was how do I condense 15 years of experience and stories and exercises and workshop descriptions and everything that I had in my head into something that is relevant for someone who does not have that experience and still understands it? And that was the most tricky part. And that was also the reason why I ended up writing hundreds of pages, because I felt all these intermediate steps and information and connections are needed so that people understand it. Until my editor then said, listen, what's the essence here? And that's when we started to cut everything out that was not essential.
So how did you figure that out? How do you narrow in, who are you focusing on to say not just what is the essence, but who's the essence for? And and do they want the essence?
It was relatively clear from the beginning who I write the book for, or who I wrote the manuscript for. It was for the people that I've worked with in the past as an ideal client profile in my head. So once the idea switched from providing them with something to providing every interested leader with something, I still had these people in mind. So managers, leaders who are responsible to create the future for an organization, to help people connect strategy to culture to leadership, to form organizations and businesses that are in it for more than just the money. And with those people in mind, I started writing. And when you have those people in mind and this concept in mind, You can then either write a book that helps people understand your thinking, your process, and your framework, or you write a book that is a step-by-step guide with exercises, with questionnaires, with everything that I use in my work with my clients. And I had mixed those two together in the beginning. And that's what made the whole thing brutally convoluted. So we decided to strip the manuscript from everything that is tactical workshop descriptions, and we kept the stories, the framework, and the process. If you are interested in the framework and the process, you will then read the book that I wrote afterwards, Creating the Strategy Legacy, which then is a purely tactical how-to book. And that is something entirely different. Once you realize that you can write a nonfiction book that is interesting for all kinds of leaders um, by giving them less, that was kind of a aha moment for me.
Mhm.
It's not about how much. It's about, can you tell stories that are so relatable that someone wants to know more about it?
Mhm.
And those who do want to know more about it, they can then read the next book.
Mhm. So tell me a little bit. One of the interesting things I think legacy building, using strategy as legacy building is like core, like theme of what you're talking about. Um, can you dive a little bit deeper into that? Like give people a sense of like, what does that even mean to use strategy as legacy building?
What you're alluding to is basically the question, why do I lead? And to be fair, I actually believe, like based on 2 decades in management, that most leaders are accidental managers. They have never asked themselves the question, do I want to lead people? They were really, really good at what they were doing at some point. And someone had the idea, hey, we make this person the leader of that team so that they can help everyone else become as good as they are. And all of a sudden you're a manager. It's purely by accident. It's not because you chose to. It's not because that's a calling. That's the issue with that is that's okay for your first, maybe your second step. But once you move up the ladder and you are really responsible, unless you really want to lead, you will become a terrible manager. And this accidental leadership versus intentionally creating a legacy as a leader, that is a very, very different game. If you show up as an accidental manager, you base your outcomes on your subject matter expertise. The more you grow as a leader, the less your initial subject matter expertise matters. What matters is, can I help people grow? Can I help them become the best managers, the best individual contributors they can be?
Mhm.
It becomes way less about what you know, but how you help people grow. And if you are not aware of that, you will be able to cause a lot of damage and harm. You will create workspaces that are, in the worst case, toxic because you believe that your subject matter expertise is still the most important thing. So you start to become a micromanager, et cetera, and everything that comes with that. If you understand that you will leave a legacy, whether you want it or not, then you might as well be intentional about it. And that is not only true for your team, that is also true for the organization that you represent toward the public. And it is also true for how you carry yourself as a leader. And the example that you set for example, shaping the culture in a business, like how do you show up? What do you do? What do you pay attention to? And if you understand those three things, like how you carry yourself as a leader, how you engage with your team, how you represent the business also toward the larger society, then you can start to be more intentional about the steps that you take. And that in itself creates your legacy. Once you move on, you have a different job, a new job in a new company, etc. People will continue to either talk about you in a good way or not. It's your choice.
Yeah, no, it's totally true, and it's a fascinating. I love the idea of like you need to make that conscious choice, right? And I think that's one of the things that people don't do, or they overthink one way or the other as well. We talked last time we spoke. We were talking about just the word strategy, and you had some really interesting thoughts on what is a strategy compared to a plan. So What is a strategy compared to a plan?
Well, no one described that better than Roger Martin in his book, Playing to Win. And so, in the famous words of the almighty Roger Martin, I would say a strategy is a theory about what happens in the future and how you can position yourself on a playing field to win on that playing field, whatever winning means for you. So it's about, I think we should do X, Y, and Z because the customer will react to that this and that way. And that in the end will make the customer buy more from us and not from our competitor. That's it in a nutshell. It's a
Mm.
theory about the future. Based on that theory, you will need to decide on how you allocate your resources and who does what by when. That is the planning part. So planning is a process. Strategy is a theory.
Mhm.
One is in your control, the planning, because you control the budgets. And one is outside of your control to large degrees, which is the customer and the theory about how you win.
Mhm. So how do you get to that theory? If you're coaching leaders how to get to how do they develop their theory? I've created tools to help people create strategies or figure out what they should be making strategies about. But how do you help people kind of get to that core?
The interesting part is, even though my company is called Brueckmann Strategy Consultants, we are not consultants in the sense of the word. We are facilitators. And what that means is we don't go into organization and tell people what to do. We help people figure out what they want to do. And that first and foremost means we help organizations understand of who they want to be once they grow up, like if you want to say it that way. Um, and what need the choices to be based on the fact that resources are not abundant. We have just a finite number of people in the organization, a finite number of dollars that we can spend. And the sooner you understand who you are, what you want to do for your customers, what problem you're uniquely positioned to solve for these customers, and what the impact will be for those customers if you're able to solve these problems, the easier it is for you to say yes to a handful of things that you want to do and no to everything else. And that is the difficult part. Saying yes to a handful of things and then following through, because that following through will cause pain in the organization. There will be people who say, I don't understand this. Why can't we just continue to do that? And it comes with a lot of angst, fear, change. And you need to be very, very mindful about how you lead that change and how you help people understand that change and what it means for them rationally and emotionally. So in a nutshell, your question was, how do you make those choices? You make them based on understanding your calling as a company, if you want to call it that way. People use the term purpose very
Mhm.
often, like your why. I use that term slightly different. The question that I ask is, when I ask is, what is your purpose? I basically ask, what are you uniquely positioned to solve or to contribute or to give a client that is better than what anyone else can do? What's your unfair advantage, if you want? And then you build on it. I think those are your words
Mhm.
in our last conversation.
Yeah.
And based on that unfair advantage, you can create something that is valuable. And if you do that really, really well, you make the lives of your clients better. And that's when they start to buy from you because they see the impact of buying from you. That's a process of certain questions. That's a process of certain workshops that you go through with your clients. But at the end, you hold something in your hand that I call an organizational identity. That is more than just the strategy part. It is a combination, an amalgamation, a connection between your culture as a business, your strategy as a business, and how you lead the business. If you bring those three things together, that's a very powerful combination.
Yeah, interesting. And so I guess to go a layer deeper, what's your unfair advantage? How come you are the one who's positioned to be able to help these companies figure out what their unfair advantage is, and how do you, maybe it's part of your journey, maybe it's part of experience, but um, yeah, how did you get to? Oh, wait a second, I'm pretty good at this.
I think the only unfair advantage that I really have is rooted in the fact that I have seen this world from three different perspectives. Like the pain that clients feel, I can relate to that because I was a client once. I was the strategy manager for the CEO of a large media organization, and we hired external consultants to help us. So I think for once, I know what those pains are. I know what works when you work with a facilitator and a consultant and what doesn't work. I have seen firsthand and I suffered the pain from doing strategy the old school way that doesn't produce the results you want. And I've seen what strategy done right can do to people and how wonderful it can be. That was my first perspective. The second perspective was when I shifted from a corporate role into an external consultant role. And I also saw how consultants operate, and I saw what good comes from it and what, let's say, not so good comes from it. And that was the moment when I realized that it is really not about consulting. It is about facilitating. It is about helping people to make sense of what they know, of what they feel, and shaping those thoughts and feelings into powerful words that help everyone in an organization to understand how they can contribute to building that future, to making the right choices, to following through on what they said they would do. And that was when we combine those three things, your understanding as like your deep understanding of customers, your experience as a consultant, and based on that, your self-identity as a facilitator. I think that is what brings the biggest value to our clients right now.
Yeah, so, no, that makes sense. Do you think there's because you had, like, 2 phases of your career as well, where you worked how do the markets differ, and what did you learn working, mostly with European, I would imagine, and then now probably more with more North American, companies? Is there anything in there that you've been able to, leverage learnings from, or is it pretty much the same?
The majority of clients I've been working with over the last decade, for example, are international corporations. Some of them have subsidiaries like literally in every continent.
Mhm.
Of course, there are cultural differences in, let's say, maturity when it comes to understanding concepts like strategy and their experience with it. But that does not necessarily have to do with where these clients have their subsidiaries or where an organization is based in. It has more to do with what is their what is the leadership's maturity when it comes to understanding leadership in a modern way and how to weave leadership, strategy, and culture together. I don't think that this has anything to do with where these clients are located or where their headquarters are. It has way more to do with what is the pain they have suffered through in the past and which decisions have they made based on that. Have they realized that their executive team was very successful in the past, but they kind of flatted out on their growth? And therefore, the leadership team needs to take a strong, hard look into the mirror and probably realize that some of the capabilities that they need to bring the business into the next growth phase is simply not there. And therefore, be vulnerable enough to admit that and to start working on your leadership, on executive leadership. And that's where really great companies understand how to weave leadership and strategy together. Many of the projects that started as a strategy project eventually had an executive team development component to it, where we help teams become like true leaders in the best sense of the word, meaning able to have conversations that don't feel like a walk in the park without becoming personal, without hurting, but with the ability to put their individual agendas to the side, become a steward for the whole business, and having the future of the business in mind when they talk strategy, not just how do I make sure that my team and my department are well represented in the strategy and basically securing my own kingdom.
So you just talked about weaving the strategy and the leadership together. What are some of the, more common, whether call it a pain point, call it a, mistake or challenge that leadership have, like trying to put those two things together? Because there's a lot of times we've all been through it. It's like it's either a really strategic person or a great leader, and sometimes those two things don't blend together very well. So, what are some of the you know pain points you've seen?
I personally don't think that you can be a great leader without being a great strategist. Um, it is one of the, let's say, 6 core traits that great leaders have that I described in the strategy legacy. You cannot be a great leader without helping the organization grow into what the organization needs to become. And that means looking beyond the tactical, looking beyond the day to day, looking beyond your subject matter expertise. If you're a CFO and you take your entire pride out of managing the finance function, then you simply don't understand what your job is. Your job is to make sure that the finance function does everything it can to help the organization reach its goals. But the goals are not purely financial. And therefore, if you're a CMO, a CSO, a CEO, your job is to be a steward for the whole business. And if you cannot do that, you will never be a true executive. You are just a representative of your department. And that's not what a great leader is. A great leader can put their day to day work, their constituents, if you want, aside and think about the future of the organization as a whole. And once that is created, that strategy is in place, you can then ask yourself, how can we in our department make sure that we do everything that we can to support that? I think this is the biggest pitfall in leaders that we've seen in working with them on strategy. If they cannot park their ego and their own department at the door, if they can't check it, then you will never have the conversations that you need to have in the room that lead to what I would call a great strategy.
And you talk about in the book as well, like mind shifts needed, right? To develop into that. One of those, the joy of missing out, right? Which I love. I think it's a great concept. Tell me a little bit about, okay, I'm an accidental leader, right? And now you're telling me to stop worrying about my team and my thing and coming to the table. How do people shift their minds? What are some of those key things that need to change in order for that person to kind of like step out of their comfort zone and develop into a great leader like that?
I think there are tons of things that you can do that have nothing to do with, let's say, you having to read a ton of books or visiting a lot of courses or God knows what. Some of the best leaders that I have seen have never gone to university. It's not about knowledge. It's not about theory. It's about how you show up and the vulnerability that you allow yourself to put into the world. And what I mean with vulnerability in the context of strategy and leadership is, do I realize that it's not about me? Do I realize what I can do and how I can shift my own perspective to better understand how other people look at the same problem? And once you create conversations that are about the problem, not about the people, then you start to lock arms and fight for the same thing or against the same thing. And that is truly powerful. That is a true leadership capability. Uh, um, if I'm not able to do that, I would bang my head against the wall. I would always ask myself, why can't they see the world how I see it? Why can't they see why this is a stupid idea? It might not be a stupid idea at all, because it is just what you think through your perspective. And a great leader can just get rid of that urge to make everyone see it through their perspective and instead step into anyone else's shoes, not because they think that person is right, but because it's important to understand where someone comes from and to truly see the world through their perspective. It helps you make balanced decisions.
And so how we can only control a certain number of things in life, right? And most of it is, ourselves. We can control ourselves. And how do you, and you must have come across this many times. You have one or, a group of people who now have to come together to be the leadership. It's not just on one person.
Yeah.
How do you navigate situations where maybe some people have that mentality and then some people don't?
It depends on how much time you have with a client, what you can do. Like if you, I try to be as open and transparent with my clients as humanly possible. I tell them what I see in a non-threatening way, non-confrontational way, and I give them options. And one of the options when you run into a situation that you just described, Dave, is that you take a step back and ask yourself, can we neglect that? And what are the consequences of neglecting that? Or should we address this first? And what you then do is you would typically try to involve these people into conversations, into coachings, into maybe run a 360 process with them that gives them, let's say, in inverted commas, the reality, which is in itself only the perception of many, many people, but it forms a picture for them. And if you do that right, they can lean in and say, wow, I was not aware of that. I was not aware of how I'm showing up in these conversations. And I now better understand what the impact of that is. And that allows these people to start to shift how they show up. They start to shift their mindset, they start to shift their perspective, and they start to shift the value that they bring to the table. If you do that right, that can be a relatively quick process. And that allows people to then be present in different ways in these conversations about strategy, because they don't feel that they need to constantly defend themselves and their departments and make sure and fight for their departments, but that they can actually show up as a steward for the whole business. And that is when you see shifts in the conversations happen, like from a qualitative perspective, when all of a sudden it's not about them anymore, but it's all of a sudden about ideas, about the best possible way forward. And yeah, these are some of the most powerful conversations that I've had as an executive coach. Seeing that someone who has been doing something for 20 years very successfully can still accept that there is something that they can do better. And those are the moments where you shift from a facilitator to a coach, and sometimes even quick for short periods of time into positions of an advisor or a consultant. But that is what you need to do. As an executive facilitator, you need to be able to also step into their shoes and understand what they do. And that sometimes requires you to take on slightly different hats yourself.
Mhm. So you developed like 9 elements. You have a framework. Walk me a little bit. Again, you don't have to go into the depth of it, but give us like the overview of the 9 elements and how that works, because I think it kind of unlocks some of the things that you're talking about here.
The 9 elements of organizational identity are grouped into 3 concentric circles. If you start in the middle, in the inner circle, you basically lay the foundation on which you can then later build your strategy. But that foundation is literally not anything else but your culture. It's really about understanding who are we, what matters to us. And a different word for that is what are our values and how do they show up in our daily work, in the way we behave. And that is where you then derive certain leadership behaviors that you want to see your leaders perform. This is where you describe basically what happens when no one is watching. That's what culture is. And you define what you do and for whom. So that's when you understand, hey, what are we producing? What is our service? And who is the client in the end? And that sounds so basic that sometimes you feel like, are you sure? Companies know who their clients are, right? Or they know what they do. Well, even small companies often have just, let's say, an accidental understanding, but no clear decision about who that client should be. And more often than not, this is a more in-depth conversation than you would expect. So this inner circle, once you have that clear, once you know what you're really, really good at, what the impact is that you create for which type of client, with which type of product or service, and what your cultural foundation is in terms of values and guiding principles, behaviors, then you can start to create a strategy, which is then the middle circle of those three circles. And basically, you ask the question, how do we move our purpose into desired impact? That is your strategy. The question, what do we do and for whom, defines how you create value, and value sits at the core of strategy. So now you know who you are, what you do, the priorities that you put in place to reach a certain picture in the future, like call it your vision. That's part of that inner circle. And you have your culture and your strategy in place. And then you go into the outer circle, where you can basically ask the question is, okay, we now have the foundation, the culture. We have the strategy. That's, let's say, the walls of your building or your tower, or however you want to say that. And now you take the outer circle and build a scaffolding around this building to prevent it from coming crashing down. And that's the questions like, what are the capabilities that we need to lead the change from where we are today to where we want to be? What are the capabilities that we need to do the things we want to do? Are we able to help everyone in the business understand what their individual contribution needs to look like and how they contribute to the bigger picture and what makes us successful? And it is the question of how do we need to manage and steer the business in different ways? It's basically the whole question about management systems. How do we run the company? How is it set up, like the structure of the company and all these things, so that we create everything that we need to follow through on our strategy and our culture. That's the 9 elements in a nutshell.
Yeah, that's awesome. I think it's great. I think one of the things that comes through, and you've said it a few times here too, is like impact, right? Impact versus purpose, or, why do you think, and I mean, obviously everybody wants to have an impact, but why do you think it's so core to focus on impact versus purpose, for example?
Purpose is an intent. Everyone can have a purpose. Everyone can say, I would like to. And everyone does. There's so many companies with purpose statements that don't mean anything to anyone in that business or to their clients, because they are fluffy, empty phrases without any substance. And everyone can do that. And they are being used to attract talent. They are being used to attract customers for all the right reasons. But they are kind of a veneer that you put around something. And once you peel the veneer back, the question is, what do you see? Is there something of substance beyond that veneer? Or is what you unveil when you pull back the veneer something that you rather not see? And that question about how do I move from that veneer to something that is truly at the core, something of value, that question comes into play when you stop talking about purpose as your main guiding principle and translate it into impact, because that's something measurable, that's something of real, that's something someone experiences, and that someone is your customer. So while I know that the question of purpose is truly foundational and very important for organizations, the true litmus test is, are you able to move that purpose into action through a strategy to create tangible impact and better lives for someone? And unless you can clearly say yes to that question, you have some work to do. No one cares about your purpose unless you do something with it.
Do you get pushback on that when you're
Yes.
trying to convince that with leadership?
I get pushback from people who have read very influential books in that space, like Simon Sinek's Start With Why is a book that made quite the wave 20 years ago around purpose. And I don't say, don't read that book. What I'm saying is read that book and then do something with it. Or understand that starting with why might be a good starting point, but that's not where you should end. Your why is just step one. And that's why the 9 elements of organizational identity, in a very early version of that framework, I had the word purpose in that inner circle. But the more I thought about it, the more I talked with clients about it, the more I realized that purpose is just the first step. And unless you don't understand your strategy as a vehicle to turn that purpose into impact, your purpose doesn't serve any purpose.
Yeah, I've interviewed another guy named Jason Krause who wrote a book called the Science Behind Success, and he breaks down a whole bunch of different things, and also a leadership coach and those kinds of things. And his philosophy that he talks about is everything's a culture problem. At the end of the day, everything comes back to being a culture problem, and it's such an important piece of the puzzle. And I think it's a part where it's probably the most abstract thing to really understand, like what is it's kind of like strategy, right? People say culture, 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 culture all the time, but it means, what does it mean? So how do you help your clients define that? Like, what is their culture, and really make it something tangible? Because it feels similar to the purpose, right? Where it's like, cool, that's great,
Yeah.
but what are we gonna do about it?
When we use the term culture with our clients, we define it as people-centric high performance. What that means is you focus on culture as an enabler for performance, for strategy. And immediately what comes to mind for many people is that misquotation of Peter Drucker, who supposedly said, which he never did, that culture eats strategy for breakfast, which is probably one of the most, sorry to say, but one of the dumbest sentences I've ever come across. Because that is kind of an excuse that you use as a leader to say our strategy doesn't work because the culture didn't accept it.
Mhm.
And guess what? It's your job as a leader to frame that culture, to shape it, to form it so that it supports the strategy. And in that sense, I agree with what you said about culture being the ultimate root cause for failure. Everything becomes a culture problem. Because if you think it through, it's actually not that everything is a culture problem. Everything is a leadership problem. Because your job as leaders is it to shape the culture that you need to make your strategy happen. And of course, that's not an either or. That's not, it's the strategy's fault, it's the leader's fault, it's the culture's fault. High performance is the result of taking those three rings of the 9 elements and bringing them together: culture, strategy, and leadership. If you always think about singular root causes for a problem or for strategy failure, that's, how do I say that? It's a pretty populist way of looking at the world. There are no simple answers in business to complex problems. That's what people try to make you believe. So every time I walk into a business that wants to work with us and talks about strategy, I look at culture and leadership at the same time, because I know they don't have a strategy problem. The strategy is the result of people coming together and talking about something in a certain way. And that is way more rooted in how they show up as leaders, in how their leadership culture is, than it is about understanding their client.
The three elements: strategy, culture, leadership. Obviously, you need all of them to be successful. Which, I mean, maybe this is trying to ask you to pick your favorite kid, but which one is the most important? Or if that one doesn't exist, they all fall apart? Or is the answer like all of them? But is there one specifically that's like, hey, this place is a disaster, we need to fix it? What's the most important one there?
This is a question that I ask myself a lot during the writing process of the strategy legacy. And what came as a result of that thought process, what came to life was my understanding of using a strategy process as the vehicle to create strategy, culture, and leadership, not just the strategy. If you and no other process, no other ring has that power. If you approach your executive team with the request of working on culture, they're going to roll back their eyes and be like, don't we have more important things to do? What about this new product launch? What about, whatever it is? And by the way, what do you want to spend $500,000 on that? Are you out of your mind? you know what? Talk to HR. Let them deal with that. If you approach your executive team and want to talk about strategy, you basically open doors that are not locked. It's very, very easy to engage them in a conversation because they immediately understand that strategy is their job. It's very difficult compared to that to help every executive understand that culture is also their job.
Mhm.
It's less tangible,
Mhm.
or at least in their mind, it is less.
For them, it is. I
In
feel
fact, it is not less tangible, but it's more in your subject matter expertise and your understanding of self as a leader that strategy is your job. So because of that, it is easier for you to use a strategy process to address culture, but you cannot do it the other way around. So if I had to pick a favorite circle, it would be the center circle, the strategy circle, because it has that reach into leadership and into culture. It makes, if you think about it, it makes the strategy process longer. If you focus only on strategy, you are faster. But if you focus only on strategy, you throw something over the fence and hope that people on the other side of the fence can do something with it. And experience shows that's not the case. So I would rather use the strategy process, extend it to a certain degree, and also address the cultural and leadership components that make the strategy happen than just hoping for the best when you just focus on strategy. And the thing is the following. You will involve the same people anyway in the organization. Every time you talk about leadership, you involve the same people that you would involve when you talk about culture and when you talk about strategy. So do it in a concise, cohesive, and integrative way. Yes, it might take a month or two longer, but the results at the end will be that these people understand how they take the strategy and integrate it and make it happen because they know how they can leverage their leadership and the culture to do that.
it leads me right to the next kind of question there, which is, sometimes consultants come in or, training and everybody learns this stuff and there's a moment in time and then slowly it erodes, whether it's through, turnover or practice, they get out of practice or whatever the case may be. How do you, suggest or give them the tools and skills to carry it through? Because I think that's the actual hardest part. It's not like implementing the change in the first place. Hey, we hired Alex. He's going to come in and work with us. Great. We do it. 6 months later, how do we make sure that we're actually putting these things that he's taught us and we all are aligned with into action on a consistent basis?
I mean, we know from learning theory that the amount of knowledge that you retain from going through something once is very minimal. So you need repetition. That's how you learn as a human being. Now, if we work with an executive team or with a leadership team or with an organization on strategy, culture, and leadership, what we want is that some key people in the organization understand how we do it. It's not what, but how.
Mhm.
And we basically train them to become internal facilitators in the future so that they can repeat certain things with their teams. The reason we do that is because we aren't dumb. We know that budgets are finite and you can't employ Alex Brueckmann for the rest of your life. Neither would I want to do that. So for us, it's super important to have people in the organization that are, I don't want to say kind of like our long arm into the
Like
organization.
champions,
You could call them champions. We kind of call them internal facilitators of change or internal facilitators of strategy. And we help them, we train them, and we certify them in our methods. So we run once a month, we run a, it's called 9UI Strategy Certification. It's an open enrollment training where we bring leaders from all different clients together. And as I said, it's open enrollment. Anyone can sign up for the certification training. And we teach them how we create these processes, how we run these processes so that they are able to do that on their own without us coming in. And that helps organizations create a certain muscle and train that muscle over time so that what you just described, Dave, this moment of like this period of fading knowledge and fading experience can be basically countered.
Mhm. Yeah, I want to be cognizant of the time. Where can people find your book, your services? Anything else you guys have on the go? How do people engage and hire you to go help fix their companies?
There's this beautiful thing called the
I
internet.
love the internet.
Just Google my name, just Google the 9 elements of organizational identity or the title of my books, and you will, in some magic way, our website will appear, and that's where you're going to find me.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Alex, for the chat. Super helpful. Really appreciate you taking the time to chat.
Thank you very much for having me, Dave.
All right, thanks. Well, that was it. That was my interview with Alex Brueckmann, the author of The Strategy Legacy. If you're interested in signing up or taking his 9EOI strategy course, check it out. You can apply at 9EOI.com. You'll find all the information you need for his book and his programs there. Thank you once again, as always, for listening and sticking with us. Really appreciate it. If you have ideas for the show, feel free to reach out. You can find me on LinkedIn at They Call Me DT. You can leave a comment on Spotify or YouTube. And please feel free to like and rate and share the show with people who might, like it as well. It would really help us out. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on The Strategy of Everything.